The swastika has become a symbol of German hope. Whoever reviles this symbol of ours is reviling our Germany. The swastika round the altar radiates hope, the day that is at last about to dawn.
In the church, we have only one altar, and that is the altar of the Most High. He who seeks anything other than this must keep away. And in the church, we have only one pulpit, and from that pulpit, faith in God will be preached, and no other faith.
On April 9th, 1945, SS officers in the Flossenburg concentration camp carried out Hitler's orders to execute some of the last remaining enemies of the Reich. Among those executed that day was the 39-year-old theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who went to his death according to a witness, brave and composed. I've hardly seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God.
For still our ancient foe doth seek to work us woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate. Yet our God doth prevail.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer's family immigrated from Nimwegen, Holland in the 16th century and settled in the town of Schwabisch Hall, residing at 7 Klosterstrasse. First as goldsmiths, and then from the 17th century as clergy, doctors, counselors, and burgomasters. Today their portraits adorn the walls of St. Michael's in Schwabisch Hall. On his mother's side, Bonhoeffer's grandfather, Karl Alfred von Hasse, married the Countess Clara von Klackreuth. Emperor Wilhelm II nominated him as court preacher in Potsdam. 2.5 years later, in 1894, he resigned and moved to Breslau as professor of practical theology. As a young woman, Dietrich's mother, Paula von Hasse, insisted on taking a teacher's examination and earned her diploma in 1894. Later in life, she would homeschool her children in their early years. Meanwhile, in 1893, having qualified as a psychiatrist from the University of Tübingen, Dietrich's father, Karl Bonhoeffer, also immediately said goodbye to Tübingen, moved to Breslau as an assistant to the famous psychiatrist Karl Wernicke. 4 years later, in 1898, he married the love of his life, Paula von Hasse. He had met her a few months earlier at the home of the physician Oscar Mayer.
A blonde, blue-eyed young girl who on her first entry into the room captivated me with her easy, natural manner and her open gaze. This first sight of the woman who was later to become my wife has become etched on my memory as an almost mystical moment that decided my life.
In Breslau, Dietrich's father, Karl Bonhoeffer, first worked as a university teacher and then as head of a clinic. Dietrich and his twin sister, Sabine, were born in Breslau on February 4th, 1906. They were the sixth and seventh out of 8 children. The parents were not enthusiastic Christians. They did not send their children to attend any church services. For occasions like baptisms, they invited Grandfather von Hasse or other clergy in the family to conduct the ceremonies at home. The children were particularly fond of playing Let's Pretend, and their favorite game, performing baptisms. In 1912, Karl Bonhoeffer was called to the Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin. As director of the University Nerve Clinic, the Charité, he took over the leading chair of psychiatry and neurology in Germany. In spite of his busy schedule, Karl Bonhoeffer always found time to be with his children, playing with them and reading to them. After early years of homeschooling, Dietrich entered the grammar school in 1913. But the summer of 1914 brought an end of an era, and at the same time, a farewell to childhood. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was 8 years old when the First World War began on August 2nd, 1914. Two years later, in 1916, the family moved to the Grunwald area of Berlin and resided at 14 Wangenheimstrasse. 9-year-old Dietrich was very interested in the war and kept a record of German advances.
We heard of the deaths of the grown-up cousins and fathers of our classmates, so we would lie awake long after our prayers and singing and try to imagine being dead and of eternal life. Every evening we tried to get nearer to eternity. It seemed to us to be very long and eerie.
Soon the war was approaching their home and family. Dietrich's brothers Karl Friedrich and Walter were drafted. Dietrich had a special message for Walter on the eve of his departure.
Now, as you leave, we say, God speed you on your journey.
As Walter got ready to leave, the mother whispered words of love.
It's only space that separates us.
Walter was wounded by a mortar on the Western Front and was moved to a field hospital.
My dearest ones, I am thinking of you with great longing, my dearest ones, minute by minute of the long days and nights, so far away. Your Walter.
This letter was written only 3 hours before Walter died on April 28, 1918. Dietrich was given the Bible Walter had received at his confirmation. From then on, Dietrich never let this Bible out of his possession. As the war dragged on, Germany became a spectacle of deprivation and despair. The German army and its allies had collapsed and were in retreat on all fronts. By November, the Kaiser had become increasingly unpopular. On 9 November 1918, he abdicated the throne, paving the way for the Weimar Republic.
The offer of peace must be transmitted immediately. The army cannot wait another 48 hours.
2 days later, Germany surrendered to an agonizing defeat, followed by the Versailles Treaty, which imposed humiliating terms on a proud people who could not believe that they had reached their nadir. Dietrich Bonhoeffer began his way toward theology in a very secular atmosphere. Unlike theologians who came from the homes of ministers and theological teachers and later discovered that there is a world outside, Bonhoeffer one day set out from the world to discover the church. Surprisingly, this happened at the age of 14. He declared to his family in a very matter-of-fact manner that he decided to become a theologian and join the ministry. His family reacted with a mixture of consternation, loathing, and pity. What a contrast to his brothers, a physicist and the other a lawyer. When pressed to defend his decision and subjected to ridicule, Dietrich vehemently declared,
"You may chop off my head, but I shall still believe there is a God."
His father would write at a later date concerning this decision of Dietrich.
When you decided to devote yourself to theology, I sometimes thought to myself that a quiet, uneventful minister's life, as I knew it, would really almost be a pity for you.
In 1921, Dietrich bought the first 2 volumes of Edward Meyer's The Origin and Beginnings of Christianity. Although he was still at school, he put Theal before his name. Dietrich, at the age of 17, left for Tübingen to follow his commitment, and according to his twin sister, Sabine.
Our childhood was now over, and our paths diverged.
Dietrich's grandmother resided in Tübingen. His father and older brothers had studied there. It was a family custom. Dietrich studied at the seminary in Tübingen for a year before moving on to the University of Berlin. However, his study at Tübingen began under the shadow of inflation. He wrote to his father on October 27, 1923.
Every meal costs 1,000 million marks.
Dietrich stayed in Tübingen only till the spring of 1924. Bonhoeffer's career is inconceivable without Berlin as its center. All the other places in his life, Breslau, Tübingen, Barcelona, New York, London, doubtless influenced him. But Berlin of the 20s and 30s, with all its variety, shaped him. In 1924, during his doctoral work at the university, Dietrich Bonhoeffer discovered the writings of the eminent theologian Karl Barth, who in later years would join him in the struggle against the Nazification of the church. Though studying to become a theologian, Bonhoeffer was a pastor at heart with a deep passion for parish work. He preached his first sermon on October 18, 1925, at the Stammsdorfer Church in Berlin. His mother was in the audience, eagerly waiting to hear her 19-year-old son deliver his first sermon. But she was astonished to hear him attack the spirituality and the piety they were accustomed to. He preached the futility of good works when scrutinized by the Most High God.
Christianity means decision, change, denial, yes, even hostility to the past. We are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do.
His doctoral thesis, The Communion of Saints, laid the foundation of his theology by declaring that the church is Christ, existing as community.
God established the reality of the church, of mankind pardoned in Jesus Christ. Not religion, but revelation. Not a religious community, but the church. That is what the reality of Jesus Christ means.
That 1927 Christmas was very special for the Bonhoeffer family. In the space of a year, Carl Friedrich qualified as a lecturer. Klaus completed his civil service training. And Dietrich, at the very young age of 21, gained his doctorate. This all happened in 1927. For the first time since Walter's death, Karl Bonhoeffer wrote in the New Year's diary again.
This Christmas we had all the surviving children together again. The Schleissers and the Nunanes are with us. Klaus, Karl Friedrich, and Dietrich. Next year, he will probably be in Barcelona.
In 1928, Bonhoeffer began his vicariate as an assistant pastor to a German-speaking congregation of the German Evangelical Church in Barcelona, Spain, as part of the internship requirement toward ordination. Bonhoeffer was shocked at the state of apathy of his congregation, which was made up of German businessmen and their families who lived self-centered lives, totally blind to the abject poverty that surrounded them. He tried to stir his parishioners to compassion.
God wanders among us in human form, speaking to us in those who cross our paths, be they stranger, beggar, sick, or even in those nearest to us in everyday life, becoming Christ's demand on our faith in him.
On December 2nd, 1928, Bonhoeffer introduced his sermon on the text of Revelation 3:20. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. To Bonhoeffer, the Advent season was the season of joy and hope that he had experienced each year at home with his family.
When the Advent comes and we sing and hear again the old Christmas carols, then gently there steals upon us a special feeling. It is a kind of homesickness. And it is a longing for a home beyond the clouds, for our eternal Father's home. For he has promised that he will come. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. And we call to him, yes, come soon, Lord Jesus. Amen.
On February 17th, 1929, Dietrich Bonhoeffer returned to Berlin to begin work on his habilitation thesis. This was a necessary step to a career as an academic theologian. In 1930, his thesis, Act and Being, was accepted.
God is not free of man, but for man. Christ is the word of God's freedom.
A letter from the dean at the Friedrich Wilhelm University dated 1st August 1930 inducted Dietrich Bonhoeffer as a lecturer. Bonhoeffer was only 24. Meanwhile, in 1929, Joseph Goebbels was appointed head of propaganda for the National Socialist Party, which at that time commanded a meager 2.8% of the votes. At the end of March 1930, Heinrich Brüning became chancellor for the first time. This marked the beginning of the emergency measures. It was the last attempt to save the Weimar Republic. On September 5th, 1930, Bonhoeffer set sail on a voyage to America, bound for the Union Theological Seminary in New York. The seminary had offered him the Sloan Fellowship. On his arrival, Bonhoeffer was overwhelmed with New York.
If you really try to enjoy New York to the full, you can wear yourself out.
However, he soon saw the other side, the distress of unemployment. Since the crash of 1929, the Great Depression was in full swing, leaving the economy in ruins. His experience here in America was very different from his student days in Germany. Unemployment was much higher than what he had seen in Germany. There was abject poverty, and homelessness was real. In the streets, crime and fighting was rampant. One sensed a general air of disillusionment. Bonhoeffer cultivated a deep friendship with Reverend Frank Fisher, a black student from Alabama, whose experiences exposed Bonhoeffer to the reality of racism. He was very deeply impressed by the vibrant faith and spirituality of these black Christians in the ghetto of Harlem, where he taught Sunday school at the Abyssinian Baptist Church and discovered how Christianity was related to the struggle for human rights. It was here in New York that something decisive happened which reshaped Bonhoeffer's life and vocation. He met John Lasserre, a French pastor and deeply committed pacifist.
We were asking ourselves quite simply what we wanted to do with our lives. He said he would like to become a saint, and I think it's quite likely that he did become one. At the time, I was very impressed, but I disagreed with him and said, in effect, that I should like to learn to have faith.
Under Lasserre's influence, Bonhoeffer began to look beyond nationalism and became an ardent worker for international peace and friendship through the churches in Europe.
Therefore, the church knows nothing of any sanctity of war. War is a struggle for life using dehumanized means. The church that prays to our Father appeals to God only for peace.
Through more conversations with Lasserre, Bonhoeffer was drawn afresh to the Sermon on the Mount. This led to the major transition in his life. Bonhoeffer progressed from being a theologian to becoming a Christian.
For the first time, I discovered the Bible I had often preached. I had seen a great deal of the church and talked and preached about it, but I had never become a Christian. I had never prayed, or prayed only very little. I was quite pleased with myself. Then the Bible, and in particular the Sermon on the Mount, freed me from that. Since then, everything has changed. It was a great liberation. It became clear to me that the life of a servant of Jesus Christ must belong to the church, and step by step it became plainer to me how far that must go.
To the surprise of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, most Americans blamed their country's economic problems in the First World War. They harbored resentment against the Germans and were suspicious that Germany was gearing for another war. Bonhoeffer was also astonished to see that the Americans gave credence to reports of Hitler's popularity. Buried in his theological pursuits, Bonhoeffer had been oblivious of the changing political scene in Germany. Humiliated by the Versailles Treaty, Germany was looking for its redemption through self-assertion. National Socialism was attracting both the populace and the intelligentsia by its promises of deliverance, and it competed successfully against other ideas of national resurgence. There was talk about the struggle for freedom, the restoration of the empire under a Kaiser, racial purity and anti-Semitism, communism and the opposition to it. Earlier, the Nazis were insignificant and were regarded as an extreme fringe group that would soon wither away. While Bonhoeffer was away from Germany in March 1930, Brüning became chancellor. But in a bitter dispute with the Reichstag, he dissolved it and set new elections for September 14th. With Joseph Goebbels as their spokesperson, the National Socialists increased their representation from 12 to 107 seats. They were now second only to the Social Democrats. Bonhoeffer's family disliked and mistrusted Hitler and the Nazis. They were especially repulsed by the horrors of Nazi-instigated anti-Semitism. For Dietrich, anti-Semitism was intensely personal. His beloved twin sister, Sabine, had married Gerhard Liebholz, whose father was a Jew. Dietrich remembered how at the engagement in 1924, his mother had prepared Sabine for the pain that she would feel as a wife to see Gerhard's Jewish background impede his advancement as a lawyer. Being a Jew in Germany was a disadvantage even in the pre-Nazi period. In one of the letters, Zabina described a nasty incident in the marketplace.
My father-in-law had gone on an excursion with us. The AS pressed insolently against the windows and took up a pretty threatening attitude of which my father-in-law was the object. Very quickly I took our 4-year-old Mary Ann, who at that time was flaxen-haired and blue-eyed, from my lap and put her on grandfather's knee. This saved the situation, and we were able to drive on undisturbed.
Klaus Bonhoeffer confirmed these political changes in a letter to Dietrich dated November 3, 1930.
Politically, the scene has changed a great deal since you left. The successes of the National Socialists have convinced the widest circles that the democratic regime of the last 10 years has failed. Domestic politics are used as an explanation for the consequences of the world economic crisis. People are flirting with fascism. I'm afraid that if this radical wave sweeps over the educated classes, all is up for the poets and the thinkers.
Amidst all the intense rivalries between political parties of all shades, Germany was in a state of chaos, which was further aggravated by the collapse of one of the largest German banks in July 1931. Millions lost their jobs, and the country plunged into economic despair. The National Socialists exploited this discontent by appealing to the national pride of the German people. Unlike the atheistic Communist Party, which most vehemently opposed it, the Nazi Party supported the churches. Well-orchestrated popular demonstrations were staged, attracting large crowds. Germany seemed to have changed completely. There was a new wave of nationalistic pride and excitement. The actual events in Germany were far worse than the reports that Bonhoeffer had received. National Socialism was no longer an insignificant fringe group.
There must be no tenderness in youth. I want to see in their eyes the gleam of the beast of prey.
It had emerged as a popular mass movement, instilling the young people with a renewed sense of national pride and patriotism. With Joseph Goebbels as its chief spokesperson, this was a false gospel of hatred-induced nationalism that went about in Christian clothing. Bonhoeffer knew that he must return to Germany to fight this tide of Nazi evil. Within a few days after his return from America, Bonhoeffer met the 45-year-old Karl Barth for the first time.
I was even more impressed by his discussion than by his writings and lectures. That's the complete Barth. I've never seen anything quite like it.
Although the two forged a close alliance in church politics, their relationship was characterized by both intimacy and distance. At the age of 25, Bonhoeffer received an appointment as a lecturer in systematic theology at the Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin. The fanatical nationalism of the now popular National Socialists mesmerized the faculty and the students. The increasing isolation because of his opposition to Nazism reinforced Bonhoeffer's desire not to limit himself to being a theologian. He was a pastor at heart. He wanted once again to serve and work in the local church. Since his license dated June 12, 1931, entitled him to serve as an assistant minister in the city of Berlin, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was ordained at St. Matthias Church in Tiergarten, a district of Berlin, on November 13, 1931. Otto Debilius, General Superintendent of the Kurmark, had asked for a student chaplain to be appointed to the Technical University in Charlottenburg. Dietrich served in that capacity from 1931 to 1933. By 1932, a circle of students had formed around Bonhoeffer, which was to produce a series of close collaborators in the church struggle yet to come. In 1932-33, Bonhoeffer conducted a seminar on creation and fall. The lectures proved so popular that Bonhoeffer's resident students persuaded him to have the manuscript published.
We must observe, too, that God does not simply call man forth out of non-being, as he has called forth everything else. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." In man, God creates his image on earth.
In addition to all these enormous responsibilities, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was also asked to take over the confirmation class at Zion Church, which had got out of control.
It's about the worst area of Berlin and with the most difficult social and political conditions. Their home conditions are generally undescribable: poverty, disorder, immorality, and yet the children are still open.
So that he could be near his confirmation candidates, Bonhoeffer rented a room at 61 Oderstrasse. The boys were very impressed that he had left instructions with the landlady to open his room to any of them at any time, even in his absence. Ironically, on the same Sunday of March 11, 1932, when Hitler made the first bid to become Chancellor and lost to Hindenburg, Dietrich Bonhoeffer confirmed his candidates and preached his confirmation sermon about Jacob meeting his brother Esau.
And now, Jacob sees the face of his brother Esau not as a face of an enemy, but as though he saw the face of God. He sees in his brother God himself and his love. Have you understood aright? He who has found God has also found his brother. And he who does not find his brother does not find God either. For God has become our brother in Christ, in order that we might see him behind every brother.
At the beginning of June 1932, when von Papen became Chancellor, many Germans expected new stability from the Christian conservative government. But in the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church on June 12, 1932, Bonhoeffer preached a pointed sermon against the misuse of the name of God by the von Papen government.
Do not our religious tendencies, in fact, conceal an unbridled impulse in the name of God to do what we want? And in the name of the Christian worldview, to play off one people against another and excite one people against another?
Encouraged with the results of his confirmation class and his church work, Bonhoeffer wanted to enter the pastoral work full-time. But by then, Nazism had influenced the church, and he was not acceptable at any parish. However, Bonhoeffer found an opportunity to open a youth club in the autumn of 1932 in the Schlossstrasse in Charlottenburg. It was funded by Anneliese Schnurman, a school friend of Bonhoeffer's sister Suzanne. After Hitler's accession on January 1933, some visitors to his club were molested on the streets. Bonhoeffer gave them refuge for a while in his hut at Biesenthal. The youth club had to be closed down, and Anneliese Schnurman, being of Jewish origin, had to emigrate. The National Socialist Party gained steadily in the elections. In September 1930, the spectacular gain had been a jump from 12 to 107 seats in the Reichstag. Now, on July 31st, 1932, they had 230 seats. At noon on January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg handed over responsibility for government to Hitler. That evening, Rüdiger Schleicher, Dietrich's brother-in-law, came home and said, "Hitler means war." All the Bonhoeffers agreed, including Dietrich. Hitler was extremely popular with Germans who wanted the pride of nationhood restored. He promised much: discipline to a nation that had almost disintegrated, dignity to a people whom the other countries in Europe despised and humiliated. Germans wanted to be proud of their country again, and Hitler promised it a future, a destiny, after he had purged it of foreign elements. It was the young who were most enthusiastic. They wanted to restore the greatness their fathers had surrendered in defeat. They did not believe that Germany had been beaten on the field of battle, rather stabbed in the back by cowardly civilians. There was a widespread belief that victorious allies intended to reduce Germany to a non-entity in Europe. There was widespread consensus against the Versailles Treaty, which they despised as being iniquitous and unjust.
The German political and economical situation today is extremely difficult. This is the result not only of having lost the World War, but above all the outcome of the fact that Germany's former enemies are oppressing her above endurance.
Germany's fate is the fate of the world. Germany's distress is the distress of the world. The prosperity of the individual nations is the prosperity of all.
Bonhoeffer's family was unable to be a passive bystander in the affairs of the state. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag was set on fire. Dietrich's brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, was an observer from the Ministry of Justice at the judicial hearing against Marinus van der Lubbe, who was accused of setting fire to it. When van der Lubbe went on hunger strike, Dietrich's father, Karl Bonhoeffer, was called in by the investigating judge to give a psychiatric opinion. The following day, after the burning of the Reichstag on February 28th, Hitler used the pretext of a communist revolution to round up his opponents and promulgated his most ominous emergency decree, the Reich President's Edict for the Protection of People and State. Signed by Hindenburg, the edict abolished the personal rights granted by the Constitution. It made possible concentration camps and was also the basis for the closure of Bonhoeffer's seminary at Finkenwald 4 years later. While the country was still under the grip of hysteria, terror, and violence, elections to the Reichstag were held as scheduled on March 5, 1933. In the streets of every city and town, Hitler exhorted Germans to hold their heads high and proudly once more as Germans. Dubbing the election day as the day of national awakening, Hitler played upon the German fear of a communist revolution. Almost 90% of the eligible voters took part in the election. Though Hitler received only 44% of the votes, undeterred, he came to power by striking a deal with von Papen and other conservative parties. Soon the Nazi Party grew in popularity, and Franz von Papen found his status being reduced to that of a spectator. The new Reichstag opened on March 21st, 1933, with a service presided over by Otto de Bilius. On March 24th, 1933, the Reichstag took the drastic step of passing the Enabling Act, allowing Hitler to govern by decree and even change the Constitution. Laws were passed declaring it an act of treason to speak against the Nazis, and these were rapidly turned into anti-Jewish propaganda. When a boycott of Jewish businesses on April 1st, 1933 was declared, Dietrich's 91-year-old grandmother, Julie Bonhoeffer, defied the SA guards posted at the entrance of the store by breaking through their cordon. A few days later, after this initial boycott of Jewish businesses, the civil service law was passed, effectively purging the civil service of all Jews. Hitler was anxious to retain support of the churches. On the eve of this act, his speech was an attempt to win that support.
We will secure for them the influence which is their due. For Christianity is the unshakable foundations of our people's ethical and moral law.
The church was also enthusiastic about the ascendancy and supremacy of Hitler. They had been disenchanted with the Weimar Republic, which had done nothing to restore the church to its former place of power and influence. Church leaders viewed the November 1918 revolution and the consequent abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II as an unparalleled disaster. Church leaders hated the Weimar Republic for accepting the humiliating peace terms of the Versailles Treaty and alleged that the Weimar Republic was dominated by liberals and Jews who, with the complicity of foreigners, were taking the country to destruction and moral decay. The church desired that Germany's honors be vindicated and old moral values of authority, family, home, and church be restored. The message that Hitler gave to the people was, "Lift up your heads, it's good to be German." He promised to restore Germany to its former glory.
The time is fulfilled for the German people in Hitler. It's because of Hitler that Christ, God the Helper and Redeemer, has become effective among us. Therefore, National Socialism is positive Christianity in action. Hitler is the way of the Spirit and the will of God for the German people to enter the Church of Christ.
As Jesus set men free from sin and hell, so Hitler rescued the German people from destruction. Both Jesus and Hitler were persecuted, but while Jesus was crucified, Hitler was exalted to chancellor. While the disciples of Jesus betrayed their master and left him in distress, the 16 friends of Hitler stood by him. We hope that Hitler will lead his work to completion. Jesus built for heaven, Hitler for the German soil. Prose taught in schools.
On February 1st, 1933 at Wuchshaus, Potsdamer Straße in Berlin, Bonhoeffer preached his first sermon after Hitler's seizure of power.
The leader must be responsibly aware of this clear limit to his authority. If he understands his function differently, then the image of the leader slips into that of misleader.
At this point, the transmitter cut out before the end of the broadcast. Censorship was in place. Swastika flags began flying atop cathedrals and churches whose altars now were adorned with swastikas. The Horst Wessel was included in the hymnals, and sermons swearing loyalty to Nazism were being preached.
The swastika has become a symbol of German hope. Whoever reviles this symbol of ours is reviling our Germany. The swastika round the altar radiates hope, the day that is at last about to dawn.
Bonhoeffer disagreed. He voiced his dissent openly.
In the church we have only one altar, and that is the altar of the Most High. He who seeks anything other than this must keep away. And in the church we have only one pulpit, and from that pulpit faith in God will be preached, and no other faith.
As part of his strategy, Hitler manipulated both the Protestant and Roman Catholic churches.
The national government sees the two Christian confessions, Catholic and Protestant, as the most important factors safeguarding our national heritage.
Jews, who comprised only 1% of the population, were accused of fostering materialism, secularism, pacifism, anti-patriotism, and moral degeneracy. These factors ensured that the church leaders would lead their flocks into the conservative movement, and they called for a synthesis of Volkstum, or the German national identity and Christianity. The German church bought into this anti-democratic myopia. The Concordat that von Papen signed with the papacy on July 20th, 1933, nullified any opposition to Hitler within the Catholic Church. At the Herrenhaus in Berlin, Protestants met together on April 3rd and 4th, 1933, to form a unified Reich Church and to harmonize church creeds with Nazism. Members were called German Christians. On April 7th, a new civil service law was passed. Its Aryan clause prohibited Jews or anyone of Jewish ancestry from holding any civil, service, or government position. Since all the churches were part of the state church, all pastors within it were state officials. Therefore, the German Christians desired to apply the Jewish clause to the church and expel pastors of Jewish background from office, and ultimately deny anyone of Jewish descent from being part of the church at all. The first organized opposition to the German Christians crystallized around the leadership of Martin Niemöller, the pastor of the Dahlem Church, and Karl Barth, the eminent theologian. It came from the Young Reformation movement, of which Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a member.
The present situation of the church demands a consideration of the true faith. Any person can become a member of the church without distinction of race and social position. The offices of the church are held as spiritual offices and not political.
On September 5, 1933, the General Synod passed laws which restricted the ministry to only those who unconditionally supported the National Socialistic State and the German Evangelical Church, and were also of Aryan descent. Bonhoeffer spelt out the consequences of such a vote.
The exclusion of Jewish Christians from the community of the church destroys the substance of the church.
In church elections, Hitler's nominee, Ludwig Müller, was elected to lead the German Christian Church. As Reich Bishop of the Reich Church, Müller desired to accelerate the Nazification of the church. The popular mission carried on by the Reich Church was reflected in the way Müller nationalized the Sermon on the Mount, rewriting the Beatitudes in terms of bravery, comradeship, and patriotism. The Beatitude of the meek of heart became, "Blessed is the one who is a good comrade at all times. He will get on well in the world." Wanting to serve both Caesar and Christ, the Reich Church finally shaped its Christ in the image of the Caesar. During the elections for the Reichsbishop, the phrase confessing church was first used.
We work for a confessing church. It is not enough that our creedal confessions remain unchanged. The church must learn anew how to confess before men the crucified Lord.
Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth corresponded with each other about the possibility of forming a free church. At the Barmen Synod of May 29th to 31st, 1934, the new confessing church, composed of pastors who opposed the Aryan Clause and other Nazi policies, affirmed the now famous Barmen Confession, mostly drafted by Karl Barth.
We repudiate the false teaching that there are areas of our life in which we belong not to Jesus Christ, but to other lords.
Most of the members were immediately on the Gestapo list for their opposition to Hitler. However, Bonhoeffer continued to raise his voice publicly in defense of the Jews after the Reichstag surrendered its conscience to Hitler.
The state which endangers the Christian proclamation negates itself. That opens up three possibilities for action by the church against the state. First, asking the state whether its actions are legitimate. Secondly, helping the victims of state action. The church has an unconditional obligation to the victims of any ordering of society, even if they do not belong to the Christian community. Do good to all people. The third possibility is not to tie the victim to the wheel, but actually to destroy the spokes of the wheel. Such a course would involve the church in direct political action.
Almost immediately after Hitler had come to power in January 1933, Bonhoeffer began to encourage and in some cases orchestrate foreign protests against Nazi policies. At the September 1933 World YMCA Conference in Sofia, Bulgaria, he successfully influenced delegates to pass a strongly worded resolution condemning the violence against Jews.
We especially deplore the fact that in some circles, the Jewish race is considered of inferior stature. We protest against the resolution of the Prussian General Synod and other synods.
In July 1933, nauseated by the stifling atmosphere of Nazi Germany, Bonhoeffer accepted an invitation to serve two German-speaking Lutheran congregations in London. He put his pension rights and security for old age at risk by avoiding recognition by the Reich Church government. From England, he wrote to Karl Barth.
I felt that I was incomprehensibly in radical opposition to all my friends, and so I thought it was probably time to go into the wilderness for a while.
He received a strongly worded response from Barth.
The German church is lost. One simply cannot become weary now, still less go to England. Be glad that I do not have you here in person, for I would let go at you in quite a different way, with the demand that you must think only of one thing, that you are a German, that the house of your church is on fire, that you belong to Berlin and not to London.
The letter devastated Bonhoeffer. He did not want to go back to Germany, yet Bonhoeffer's self-imposed exile in London did not bring tranquility. This became a time for preparation.
And I believe that the whole of Christianity must pray with us, that this becomes resistance to the point of shedding blood, and that people can be found who will endure it.
Germany was in transition to totalitarianism. After the death of Hindenburg on August 2, 1934, Hitler merged the offices of President, Chancellor, and Commander-in-Chief to declare himself as the Führer and Reichskanzler. A few days later, on August 19th, Hitler ordered a special referendum to endorse his rule as the Führer. Over 90% of the Germans overwhelmingly voted in favor of Hitler and legitimized the reign of terror under the Nazis, whose enormous popularity was reflected in the grand and intimidating display of parades and processions with banners proclaiming "Germany awake." Thousands gathered in city after city, holding rallies and demonstrating their allegiance to the Führer. Hitler was credited for having ushered in an era of prosperity, eliminating the unemployment and poverty of the Weimar days. Hitler's industrial policies encouraged the construction of large industrial complexes, generating increased employment. With the standard of living rising dramatically, the streets were displaying wealth and prosperity. There was a boost in consumer confidence which was evident from the shops and shoppers in the daytime and the dazzling displays of the nightlife that had once again returned to German cities. Hitler augmented the private sector employment with massive investment in public projects like subways and highways. Hitler's favorite project was the People's Car, or Volkswagen, a small and affordable car for every German household. Under the banner of one people, one nation, one leader, Hitler mesmerized the populace into living and dying for him as their Führer. He stirred up mass hysteria around the myth of the German master race and made them assume they were destined to be the world's rulers. Bonhoeffer, however, was not deceived by Hitler's lies and his human mask. He had already realized that Hitler and the Nazis were inherently evil and that they would manipulate the church to sell its soul to Hitler.
Hitler has shown quite clearly the sort of man he is, and the church must know with whom it is dealing. Isaiah did not go to Sennacherib. Hitler will not and may not listen. His heart has been hardened, and precisely because of this, he should make us listen. That is about how things are. We need to be converted, not Hitler.
In the summer of 1932, Dietrich Bonhoeffer met the English Bishop of Chichester, George Bell, at an ecumenical meeting in Geneva. From then on, there were regular consultations between them. In later years, Bishop Bell would become the main liaison between the Allies and the anti-Nazi group of the Abwehr. When the official German Reich Church required theological students to submit to an examination to verify their Aryan descent, the anti-Nazi confessing church felt compelled to take theological education into its own hands.
All theological education these days belongs in the church and in religious communities in which pure doctrine, the Sermon on the Mount, and worship are taken seriously.
By December of the year 1934, Karl Barth had become increasingly involved in opposition to Hitler by playing a major role in the confessing church, especially at the Barmen Synod in 1934. This led to his dismissal from the university. In early 1935, when Karl Barth was unavoidably leaving Germany for exile in Switzerland, Bonhoeffer voluntarily went back to Germany, to which the confessing church was calling him. In 1935, Dietrich Bonhoeffer established a seminary of the confessing church, first at Zingst on the Baltic coast, and later that summer, it moved southeast to Finkenwalde, a suburb of Stettin. The seminary was housed at an abandoned private school. The students were aware that they would not be easily accepted by the established German church because of their fierce independence. One of them was Eberhard Bethke, who met Bonhoeffer for the first time at this seminary and later would become his closest lifetime confidant and friend. It was here that Bonhoeffer worked on the theme which had captivated him for years, the cost of discipleship. Through ideas like costly and cheap grace, simple obedience, and above all in his exposition of the Sermon on the Mount, Bonhoeffer related Christian faith to the figure of the present Christ.
The life of Jesus Christ has not yet been brought to an end upon this earth. Christ continues to live in the life of his disciples.
Bonhoeffer indicted Christians for replacing a living and obedient faith in Jesus Christ by a belief in doctrine about faith. He warned against cheap grace.
Cheap grace is the deadly enemy of the church. Cheap grace means grace sold on the market, like Cheap Jack's wares. Grace without price, grace without cost. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance. Baptism without church discipline. Communion without confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship. Grace without the cross. Grace without Jesus Christ. We have gathered like ravens round the carcass of cheap grace, and there we have drunk of the poison which has killed the life of following Christ.
Bonhoeffer lamented that the church had become a peddler of cheap grace. By allowing itself to be captured by Nazism, the church had destroyed the Christian faith.
The price we are now having to pay today is only the inevitable consequence of our policy of making grace available to all at too low a cost, giving that which was holy to the scornful and unbelieving. Cheap grace has turned out to be utterly merciless to our church.
Bonhoeffer challenged the church to the costly grace of following Christ in discipleship.
Costly grace is the gospel which must be sought again and again, the gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life, and it is grace because it gives man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it cost God the life of his Son. Ye were bought at a price. And what has cost God much cannot be cheap for us.
For Bonhoeffer, though theologically faith comes before obedience, faith and obedience are inseparable, like two sides of a coin.
Only he who believes is obedient, and only he who is obedient believes. Only the obedient believe. If we are to believe, we must obey a concrete command. Without this preliminary step of obedience, our faith will only be pious humbug and lead us to the grace which is not costly. If you dismiss the word of God's command, you will not receive his word of grace. How can you hope to enter into communion with him when at some point in your life you are running away from him? The man who disobeys cannot believe, for only he who obeys can believe.
Meanwhile, Dietrich's father, Karl Bonhoeffer, retired from the Charité on April 1st, 1936. They gave up the big house in Wangenheimstrasse and moved into a new house on 43 Marienburger Allee in the Charlottenburg area of Berlin. From then on, the attic room to the west belonged to Dietrich. From his windows, he looked out over to number 42, the home of his sister Ursula and her husband Rüdiger Schleicher. Edicts, prohibitions, and arrests were the means by which the Ministry of Church Affairs tried to subdue the confessing church. On June 9, 1937, collection of offerings for the confessing church was declared illegal. Bishop Heckel of the Reich Church accused Bonhoeffer of being a pacifist and therefore an enemy of the state, and called for measures to be taken to stop him from training German theologians and pastors. He and all other teachers from the seminaries of the confessing church were barred from the University of Berlin. The Gestapo raided churches and meetings, arresting hundreds. On July 1st, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Eberhard Bethge went to Dahlem for consultation with Martin Niemöller at his house. However, Niemöller had been taken away only minutes before by the Gestapo.
First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me.
Niemöller, however, did speak out, and as a consequence, lost 8 years of his life to the Nazis. He remained in the concentration camps of Sachsenhausen and Dachau till the end of the war in 1945. While Bonhoeffer and Bethge were still in the house, the Gestapo returned and put them all under house arrest, making them involuntary witnesses to an 8-hour search of Niemöller's study. The news of the persecution of the confessing church reached London.
This is a critical hour. It is not only the fate of the individual pastors, it is the case of the attitude of the German state to Christianity. Times, July 3rd, 1937.
On August 29, 1937, all substitute colleges set up by the confessing church were banned. The wave of arrests also reached Finkenwalde students. By Christmas 1937, the Gestapo had arrested 27 of them and had sealed shut the doors to Though in 1937 the Gestapo throttled the Finkenwalde Seminary, Bonhoeffer moved further east, where he continued his ministry of training pastors by disguising it as a collective pastorate in the towns of Kostlin and Groß-Schlonowitz. This entire region of Upper Pomerania, before the war, was in Germany, but now is a part of Poland. Instead of registering students as members of a seminary, they were appointed as probationary assistant pastors to clergy who were sympathetic to the confessing church. Bonhoeffer spent half the week living with the other seminarians in the parsonage, just a short distance away from the center of the town where the historic Marienkirche is located. If present on Sundays, he would preach at this Lutheran church, which stands today as a Roman Catholic cathedral. In the second half of the week, Bonhoeffer regularly taught at Groß-Schlonowitz and Schlawe, where he lived at the parsonage next to the church, which also is now a Roman Catholic church. A picture of the crucified Christ, which hung above the altar at that time, can still be seen today in the foyer of the church. On January 11, 1938, there was a new wave of arrests of pastors of the Confessing Church in Dahlem. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had been there, was prohibited from staying at Berlin. His father managed to get this prohibition restricted to visits on church business. Thus, Bonhoeffer continued to visit his family in Berlin. The year of 1938 was the year of greatest weakness for the Confessing Church. All active pastors were required to take the oath of allegiance to the Führer. Anyone who refused to take the oath of allegiance was to be dismissed.
I swear that I will be faithful and obedient to the Führer of the German nation and people, Adolf Hitler, observe the laws, and conscientiously fulfill the duties of my office. So help me God.
Bonhoeffer wanted the leadership of the Confessing Church to defend the right of pastors to refuse taking this oath. Instead of upholding this right, the leadership evaded its moral responsibility by leaving the decision to each individual pastor. This was exactly what the Gestapo wanted, because now they were able to identify those pastors who were openly disloyal to Hitler. Enraged at the spineless behavior of the church, Bonhoeffer rebuked.
Will the confessing church ever learn that the majority in matters of conscience kills the spirit?
Bonhoeffer was frustrated by his own confessing church because he did not openly and firmly oppose the anti-Jewish violence. For Bonhoeffer, the only criterion to determine the success and failure of the church was the sincerity and potency of its activities on behalf of the Jews.
However liturgically correct our services are, and however devout our prayer, however brave our testimony, they will profit us nothing. Nay, rather, they must needs testify against us, that we have as a church ceased to follow our Lord. God will not be separated from our brother. He wants no honor for himself, so long as our brother is dishonored. Where is Abel, your brother?
When asked to defend his uncompromising stand, he would always refer to the scripture in Proverbs 31:8.
Who will speak up for those who are voiceless?
In September 1938, Bonhoeffer wrote his little classic, Life Together, in which he recorded the experiments of the seminary.
Christianity means community through Jesus Christ and in Jesus Christ. It means, first, that a Christian needs others because of Jesus Christ. It means, second, that a Christian comes to others only through Jesus Christ. It means, third, that in Jesus Christ we have been chosen from eternity, accepted in time, and united for eternity.
On midnight of September 9th, Dietrich Bonhoeffer helped his twin sister Sabine, her husband and the children, to escape to Switzerland en route to England, barely 4 weeks before the passports of non-Aryans were declared invalid without the dreaded Jews' stamp on it. November 9th, 1938, the persecution of the Jews reached a high point with the so-called Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night, in which the show windows of Jewish businesses were smashed. Jewish synagogues were burned and Jews were brutalized on a massive scale all over Germany in an orgy of lethal and legal vandalism. That night, Bonhoeffer was away in Groß-Schlanowitz, but rushed to Berlin when he found out what had happened. He vociferously discredited all attempts to attribute this barbarism to the so-called curse on the Jews because of Christ's death. In his Bible, he underlined Psalm 74:8. They say to themselves, "Let us plunder them. They burn all the houses of God in the land," and marked it with the date of Crystal Night. As early as 1935, Bonhoeffer had said,
"Only he who cries out for the Jews may sing Gregorian chants."
Bonhoeffer felt betrayed and isolated even by his own confessing church, which had refused to be a brave and resolute opposition to the essentially evil Nazi regime.
We too had learned to lie before long and adapted ourselves to public wrong. And when the defenseless were felled by force, we took it all as a matter of course. And that which within our hearts still flamed remained unspoken and unnamed. We checked the blood's insurgent flow and trampled out the outward glow.
The event which Bonhoeffer feared most was the least discussed in his family: conscription to the military service, which in 1938 was getting closer and closer.
On our advertisement column, there is an announcement of the drafting of those born in 1906 and 1907. I often wonder whether anything will come of your journey, and if so, what?
Almost a year earlier, in February 1938, Bonhoeffer had developed closer contacts with his brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, who'd been preparing a military-led coup d'etat with Admiral Wilhelm Canaris and other colleagues in the Military Intelligence Unit, or Abwehr. Though opposition to Hitler and attempts to oust him originated as early as 1934 and continued throughout his reign, no opposition movement was able to survive the ever-watchful Gestapo with its reign of terror and summary executions. The Allies were reluctant to support or even grant credence to these opposition movements, which were not only splintered by enormous ideological differences, but were also under nationalist pressure to avenge the humiliating defeat of 1919. Consequently, as soon as the war erupted, the Allies demanded unconditional surrender, raising doubts if a new German regime following a military coup would be recognized. Hans von Dohnanyi confided in Dietrich Bonhoeffer about the planned coup. Until that point, Dietrich had taken no political action against the state, and he had been careful to express all his protest within the framework of legality. Besides, Bonhoeffer saw his battle as a theological one. But now Bonhoeffer had technically become an accessory to the plan, a crime punishable by death. He also feared being an unwitting cause of the Gestapo stumbling onto their plans. For all these reasons, he decided to leave Germany.
I cannot reconcile it with my conscience to take part in a war in these circumstances.
His former teacher, Reinhold Niebuhr, and his closest American friend, Paul Lehmann, were eager to save Bonhoeffer, who was in obvious danger. They arranged a speaking tour for him and assumed that once the war broke out in Germany, Bonhoeffer would remain in America. But Bonhoeffer was not at ease with himself in New York. His daily Bible reading for 24 June 1939 confirmed God's will for him. The one who believes does not flee.
We can in fact justify anything. But in the last resort, we are acting from a plane that is hidden from us, and we can only ask God to judge and forgive us. At the end of the day, I can only ask that God may judge this day and all my decisions mercifully.
To the disappointment of his friend Paul Lehmann, who had arranged the lecture tour, on the 7th of July 1939, as Hitler was proudly rearming Germany, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, within 5 weeks of having left Germany, returned to Europe to war.
Today, Germany. Tomorrow, the world.
I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction after the war if I do not also share the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany will face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying our civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make that choice in security.
Bonhoeffer's decision to return to Germany did not at first bring about any striking changes to his life. He resumed work at the collective pastorate in Lower Pomerania. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler declared war on Poland.
Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit bereits regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 Uhr wird jetzt zurückgeschossen.
Bonhoeffer was in Klein Krosnin, now part of Poland, and called Krosinko, where he was writing his book, Ethics. On September 4th, 1940, the Gestapo imposed a ban on Bonhoeffer, which prevented his speaking in public on the grounds that he was subverting the people. He also had to report regularly to the police. Bonhoeffer appealed unsuccessfully against this ban in writing and tried to convince them of his patriotism. He even ended the letter with the greeting, Heil Hitler. The end of the collective pastorate in 1940 ended the possibility of continuing his pastoral work. Yet Bonhoeffer did find a way to continue that work through his writings. From now on, Bonhoeffer lived in his parents' home, seriously deliberating on his future and the future of Germany. With the fall of France, Hitler had wiped out the shameful defeat of 1918 and rehabilitated German pride. Anyone who now thought in terms of traditional ethics could no longer successfully oppose Hitler in any way. While the people of Germany, including many church leaders, were hailing the victories of their army and the Führer, Bonhoeffer was publicly lamenting the church's guilt and the suffering which the Nazis were unleashing.
The church confesses that she has witnessed the lawless application of brutal force, the physical and spiritual suffering of countless innocent people, oppression, hatred, and murder, and that she has not raised her voice on behalf of the victims and has not found ways to hasten to their aid. She is guilty of the deaths of the weakest and the most defenseless brothers of Jesus Christ.
This freedom to write was made possible, ironically, by his becoming a part of the conspiracy to stage a coup d'etat. For Bonhoeffer, it was an agonizing decision, an acute moral dilemma. He debated the rightness of any action, be it the radical step of eliminating Hitler or the traditional Christian obedience of civil authority, which in this case meant supporting genocide. He remembered his own words, his pacifism, and his commitment to the Sermon on the Mount.
The brother's life is a divine ordinance, and God alone has power over life and death.
But the genocide sweeping Europe made planning an assassination attempt on Hitler's life all the more a moral imperative instead of a murderous act. Bonhoeffer saw Hitler as a demon whose evil could only be exorcised by eliminating him.
If we claim to be Christians, there's no room for expediency. Hitler is Antichrist. Therefore, we must go on with our work and eliminate him, whether he is successful or not.
On the other hand, as a Christian pastor and a pacifist, he opposed the use of violence and therefore hesitated to join those planning an assassination attempt against Hitler. Two things eventually helped determine his resolve. One, with the deportation of the Jews taking place on a massive scale. For Bonhoeffer, the actions of the state had become horrendous. He was aware of the Grunewald station in Berlin, from where masses of innocent victims were transported to their deaths. Second, many of Bonhoeffer's friends had seen the inside of the concentration camps, and their full horror was beginning to emerge. After much internal struggle, Bonhoeffer became convinced that he had only one option. He must act to remove Hitler. Only this would resolve his dilemma. Though he viewed violence as morally indefensible, he also believed that inaction in the face of death camp horrors was spiritually suicidal.
It is not only individual Germans and individual Christians who are guilty. Germany and the church are guilty too. Germany and the church themselves must repent and be justified. Only in defeat can we atone for the terrible crimes we have committed against Europe and the world.
He decided he must risk God's judgment on his own actions that others might live. They must be rescued from these death camps.
Our actions must be understood as an act of penitence.
In 1940, Dietrich Bonhoeffer joined the resistance. For a cover, his brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, recruited him to the military intelligence agency Abwehr, under the pretext that he would be useful in its counterintelligence operations because of his contacts with various influential church leaders in Switzerland, Britain, America, and Scandinavia, and thus exempted him from military service and the obligation to report to the Gestapo. Instead, Bonhoeffer used these contacts for the resistance. Posing as a courier for the Abwehr, he traveled extensively throughout Europe for the resistance to find out how the Allies would react to the planned coup d'etat. But for Bonhoeffer, the time had come to grab the wheels by the spokes. From the end of November 1940 to February 1941, Bonhoeffer lived in Natal, where he was a guest at the Benedictine Abbey. He had his meals with the monks to the accompaniment of liturgical tunes.
I've been here since yesterday. A most friendly welcome. In short, everything one could want.
It was from here in this monastery that he struggled to prevent the confessing church from dying out as a result of conscription or direction to war work. Bonhoeffer attempted to influence the church minister Hans Kerl through intermediaries whom he met there. He met the Minister of Justice, Dr. Gertner, in connection with the matter.
We spent the day together and discussed a good deal. He was very optimistic in the K matter. The only question is what K himself can do. Things are now moving on to some degree since reports of drafting for war work are increasing.
Gertner was buried a month later. Bonhoeffer celebrated Christmas in Etal with the Dohnanyis and Bethke's company. He could not let Advent pass without preaching. Since he was forbidden to preach, he wrote a sermon, a meditation for Christmas in the form of a sermon, basing it on Isaiah 9:6-7. Unto us a child is born.
To us a child is born. God's redemption is not by power, nor by might, not by wisdom or clever strategy, but in a helpless child. With justice and with righteousness, Jesus governs his kingdom. His kingdom shall be a kingdom of righteousness, not by self-righteousness, but by God-given righteousness. We find it when we accept his lordship and when we let him give us a new life in love. He wants us to be with him, not for his sake, but for ours. God with us, Emmanuel, Jesus. That is the secret of this holy night. We rejoice. To us a child is given. To us a child is born.
On September 19th, 1941, the decree that Jews should wear a yellow star came into force. All Jews had to wear this badge stitched onto their clothing. Bonhoeffer got involved in a bold action initiated by the Abwehr for a few Jews. Admiral Canaris gave instructions to save a group of about 12 to 15 Jews by getting them to Switzerland on the pretext that they were being used by the Abwehr. The enterprise was called U-7 because at first only 7 people were involved. Because of its strict neutrality, Switzerland refused entry to any non-Aryans. Through the intervention of Alphonse Kirchlin, president of the Swiss Church Alliance, Bonhoeffer finally succeeded in taking the Jews to safety in 1942. Naturally, the Gestapo was very suspicious of the entire operation and soon launched an investigation which played a decisive role in Bonhoeffer's future. The years 1941 and 1942 were of incessant activity as Bonhoeffer traveled abroad extensively on secret missions for the resistance. It was here in Sigtuna, Sweden, that Bonhoeffer expressed the movement's willingness to negotiate a compromise peace following the overthrow of Hitler. Bonhoeffer's British liaison for the resistance, Bishop Bell, conveyed these plans to the British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, but received an unfavorable response.
Without casting a reflection on the bona fides of your informants, I am satisfied that it would not be in the national interest for any reply to be sent to them.
By now, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin were demanding Germany's unconditional surrender. At the end of this period, on January 17, 1943, at the age of 37, Bonhoeffer announced his engagement to 18-year-old Maria von Wedemeyer, with whom he had fallen in love in 1942 during his stays with her family in Patzig between his Abwehr journeys. Her mother, Ruth von Wedemeyer, was worried by the difference in their ages. Bonhoeffer had first met Maria when, at 13, her grandmother, Countess Ruth von Kleistretzau, had brought her on a visit to the Confessing Church Seminary in Finkenwalde. Bonhoeffer was a frequent visitor to the von Kleist home, especially on holidays during the 1930s. It was here that he had completed the Cost of Discipleship in the spring of 1937. In that year, Maria was only 13 and Dietrich was 31. But by 1942, she had turned 18. Their engagement was a clear sign that Bonhoeffer did not imagine himself being forced into an apocalyptic opposition.
In the midst of general destruction, a man desires to build. In the midst of a life lived from day to day, he demands a future. In the midst of our exile from the earth, he demands some living space. In the midst of the general misery, some happiness. And the overwhelming fact is that to this improbable desire, God says yes. That here, God confirms our will with his, when one would expect the opposite. And so marriage becomes something quite new, majestic, glorious for those of us here in Germany.
On March 13th, 1943, Hitler was expected to fly to the front to the Central Army Group in Smolensk. This was the occasion for the attempt on his life. Eberhard Bethke drove Hans von Dohnanyi to the night train in Karl Bonhoeffer's car. Dohnanyi flew to Smolensk with special explosives in his briefcase for Treschow and Schlabrendorf. Although the explosives were on board, Hitler landed unharmed. The bomb and the plot had failed. This same day, Bonhoeffer received new draft papers from the Munich conscription office. Major General Oster used his authority for the last time and released Bonhoeffer from the order. On Sunday, March 21st, Heroes Memorial Day, Hitler was visiting an exhibition of captured military equipment in the Berlin Arsenal. Colonel Truskow arranged for a colleague to guide the Fuhrer for the show. The colleague was carrying a bomb in his person to blow up both himself and Hitler. On that day, the whole family were in the Schleicher's house practicing a cantata for Karl Bonhoeffer's 75th birthday. Dietrich was sitting at the piano, Klaus playing the cello, Rüdiger Schleicher the violin, and Donaghy was in the choir. Christine von Donaghy whispered to her sister Ursula Schleicher,
"It must be going off any moment."
But minute by minute went by and the telephone did not ring. Hitler had not kept his planned timetable. He had left the exhibition 10 minutes early. This attempt, too, failed. Ironically, on March 31st, 1943, Hitler awarded the Goethe Medal for honorable service to Dr. Karl Bonhoeffer to coincide with his 75th birthday celebration. The family, friends, and co-conspirators of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had gathered together for this birthday celebration, were oblivious of the events of a few months ago. When in 1942, the customs post at Prague had discovered irregularities in the papers of someone who claimed to be acting for the Abwehr in Munich. Consul Wilhelm Schmidhuber, a member of the Abwehr, was arrested, and Dr. Joseph Müller, the intermediary between Abwehr and the Vatican, was interrogated. There were incriminating statements in connection with putting Operation 7 into effect. The names of Hans von Donaghy and Dietrich Bonhoeffer were noted. From his home on Marienburger Allee about midday on April 5th, 1943, Bonhoeffer tried to telephone his sister Christine von Donaghy. He heard a man's voice on the telephone. At that moment, he knew that the house was being searched. Without disturbing his parents, Dietrich went up to his attic and prepared for his own arrest. Dietrich walked over next door to his sister Ursula Schleicher's house and asked her to cook him a large meal. About 4 o'clock, his father came over.
"Two men want to talk to you in your room."
So on that fateful Monday of April 5th, 1943, along with his sister Christine and brother-in-law Hans von Donaghy, were taken separately to the Charlottenburg and Moabit prisons. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was taken to the military interrogation prison in Tegel. The night of April 6, 1943 was cold at Tegel. Bonhoeffer could not bring himself to use the blankets of the plank bed as he could not stand the stench that rose from them. He spent 18 months in a room about 6 feet by 9 feet with a plank bed, shelf, stool, and bucket. A board door with an observation hole looking from the outside in, and a skylight window above head height on the opposite side. He kept a daily routine of Bible reading, prayer, and singing the many hymns of Paul Gerhardt, which he had memorized. During the interrogations, Bonhoeffer effectively disguised the true nature of his Abwehr activities and was permitted to have visitors and receive letters.
Dear parents, I do want you to be quite sure that I'm all right. Strangely enough, the discomforts that one generally associates with prison life hardly bother me at all. The 75th birthday were a fortnight ago today. I can still hear the chorale that we sang in the morning and evening with all the voices and instruments. Praise to the Lord.
The Lord who o'er all things so wondrously reigneth, shelters thee under his wings, yea, so gently sustaineth.
That is true, and it is what we must always rely on. Your Dietrich.
Afraid that he might not stand up to possible torture and perhaps give away his friends, he wondered, should he not kill himself? On a piece of paper which had survived from the first weeks in prison, Bonhoeffer wrote,
Suicide not because of consciousness of guilt, but basically because I am already dead.
Besides writing to his parents, Bonhoeffer wrote letters to his friend Eberhard Bethge and to his fiancée, Maria von Wedemeyer. He lived for these letters and by these letters. In the period between November 1943 and August 1944, letters amounting to 200 closely written pages reached Eberhard Bethge, all of them smuggled out. They are the basis of the letters and papers from prison, which today are read all over the world. On May 15, 1943, a few days after the release of Christine von Dohnanyi, and while Dietrich Bonhoeffer was still confined to his prison cell, Eberhard Bethge married Dietrich's niece, Renate Schleicher. From his cell, Dietrich sent a special message for the couple.
God adds his yes to your yes. He is guiding your marriage. God makes your marriage indissoluble. God establishes a rule of life by which you can live together in wedlock. God has laid on marriage a blessing and a burden. God gives you Christ as the foundation of your marriage. From the first day of your wedding, the rule must be welcome one another for the glory of God.
Bonhoeffer communicated with his family using a code while investigations were being made about his Abwehr service, his role in Operation 7, and his journeys for the conspiracy. At the trial in the military court, the original charge of treason and high treason could not be sustained. Bonhoeffer was accused of infringements of military law. He expected to be released very soon and wrote to his fiancée Maria about marriage.
I am under God's special guidance here, I feel sure. Moreover, when I consider the state of the world, the total obscurity enshrouding our personal destiny, and my present imprisonment, our union can only be a token of God's grace and goodness, which summon us to believe in Him. Our marriage must be a yes to God's earth. It must strengthen our resolve to do and accomplish something on earth. I fear that Christians who venture to stand on earth with only one leg will stand in heaven on only one leg too.
Throughout his life, Bonhoeffer had welcomed the Christmas season with music and preaching. But Christmas 1943 greeted him with severe restrictions in his prison cell. Yet he was neither fretful nor anxious.
When everything is bearing down on us to such an extent that we can barely withstand it, the Christmas message comes to us that all our ideas are wrong, and that what we take to be evil and dark is really good and light because it comes from God. Our eyes are at fault, that is all. God in the manger, wealth in poverty, light in darkness, succor in abandonment. No evil can befall us. What it meant is true endurance and true rejoicing in the knowledge that Christ is with us. Remember that Christ, too, frequents prisons, and He will not pass me by.
Bonhoeffer was disappointed that he was not able to baptize the first child of Eberhard and Renate, and whom the parents had named after him, Dietrich Wilhelm Rudiger Bethge. He sent a baptismal sermon.
Our being Christians today will be limited to two things: prayer and righteous action among men. There will be those who pray and do right and wait for God's own time. May you be one of them.
Bonhoeffer continued his pastoral ministry in this Nazi prison and later even in the concentration camps, especially to those who had been condemned to death. His one concern in prison was to get permission to minister to the sick and his fellow prisoners, and his ability to comfort the anxious and depressed was amazing. But Bonhoeffer was realistic about himself.
Who am I? They often tell me I would step from my cell's confinement calmly, cheerfully, firmly, like a squire from his country house. Who am I? They often tell me I would talk to my warders freely and friendly and clearly as though it were mine to command. Who am I? They also tell me I would bear the days of misfortune equably, smiling, proudly, like one accustomed to win. Am I then really all that which other men tell me of? Or am I only what I know of myself? Restless and longing and sick like a bird in a cage, struggling for breath as though hands were compressing my throat, yearning for flowers, for the voices of birds, thirsting for words of kindness, for neighborliness, trembling with anger at despotisms and petty humiliation, tossing in expectation of great events, powerlessly trembling for friends at an infinite distance, weary and empty at praying, at thinking, at making, faint and ready to say farewell to it all. Who am I, this or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once, a hypocrite before others and before myself a contemptibly woebegone weakling? Or is something within me still like a beaten army, fleeing in disorder from victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine.
Once again, on July 20th, 1944, another attempt to assassinate Hitler was made, but he survived the bomb attack with minor injuries on his right arm. The editor of the official church journal, Pastorate and Theology, exhorted Christians to thank God for saving the Führer's life.
We are grateful to God with all our hearts, and with all our congregations ask God for his support and help for the great responsibilities which the Führer has to bear and discharge in these most difficult times.
As for Hitler himself, he was both angry and elated. Impressing Mussolini, who was on an official visit at that time, Hitler boasted of his miraculous escape and vowed revenge.
I am now more than ever convinced that the great cause which I serve will survive its present perils. I will crush and destroy the criminals who have dared to oppose themselves to Providence and me.
The Gestapo and the SS immediately carried out a purge. Because of his imprisonment, Bonhoeffer was not directly involved, but some of the conspirators were connected to Bonhoeffer. 1 month later, on August 22nd, his brother-in-law Hans von Dohnanyi was sent to the concentration camp in Sachsenhausen. Bonhoeffer realized that his fate was sealed. His only hope was in a plan to escape with the help of a devoted guard, Corporal Knoblauch, who was prepared to smuggle him out of prison. Well, mechanics' garments and food coupons for the escape were already passed on to Bonhoeffer. But on October 1st, 1944, his brother Klaus, who was the legal advisor to Lufthansa, was arrested in the Schleicher's house on Marienberger Allee. 2 days later, on October 4th, Rudiger Schleicher and Eberhard Bethger were also taken into custody. Bonhoeffer did not want to further endanger his family. He abandoned his escape plan. Reflecting on this decision, he composed his famous poem, The Death of Moses, in which Moses accepts his fate to die on the mountain in God's presence.
To punish sin and to forgiveness you are moved. God, this people I have loved, that I bore its shame and sacrifices and saw its salvation, that suffices.
Bonhoeffer found the key to all problems, including this long and lonely internment, in his continuous living in Christ.
All that we may rightly expect from God and ask him for, is to be found in Jesus Christ. In Jesus, God has said yes and amen to it all, and that yes and amen is the firm ground on which we stand.
Following the debacle of July 20th, 1944, Hitler called for an extended investigation during which the Gestapo discovered Bonhoeffer's travel diaries. These documents implicated Bonhoeffer and the Abwehr. Consequently, Bonhoeffer's situation deteriorated rapidly. On Sunday, October 8, 1944, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was transferred to the underground Gestapo prison, which was concealed by the facade of the Gestapo headquarters on Prinz Albrechtstrasse. Life in the Gestapo prison was very arduous and restrictive. Bonhoeffer was deprived of all privileges. The only exception was the permission to write one letter each for Christmas and New Year. Bonhoeffer wrote the same poem in both the letters, the Christmas letter to his fiancée, Maria, and the New Year letter to his mother, whose birthday fell on December 30th.
The old year still torments our hearts, unhastening. The long days of our sorrow still endure. Father, grant to the souls thou hast been chastening, that thou hast promised the healing and the cure. Should it be ours to drain the cup of grieving, even to the dregs of pain at thy command? We will not falter, thankfully receiving all that is given by thy loving hand. By kindly powers so wondrously protected, boldly we'll face the future, come what may.
We are with God at night and morn, just as sure on each new day.
For interrogation purposes, at the end of January 1945, Dohnanyi was also brought to the Gestapo prison. On April 6, 1945, he was taken back to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where on the same day he was court-martialed and sentenced to death. He was executed on April 9, 1945. On February 2, 1945, Klaus Bonhoeffer and Rüdiger Schleicher were condemned to death. Klaus Bonhoeffer and Rüdiger Schleicher were shot by the Gestapo on April 23, 1945. A bomb crater in the Dorotheenstadt cemetery in Berlin became their grave. The next day, February 3, 1945, the Allies unleashed their heaviest air attack on the center of Berlin, transforming it into a wilderness of smoke and ashes. Amidst all this ruin and destruction, Dietrich's parents tried desperately to visit him for his birthday, which was the following day on February 4th. His birthday gift included a book by the philosopher Plutarch. It would play an important part in his destiny. His parents tried again on the usual Parcels Day, Wednesday, the 7th of February, to get into the head office. Their parcel, which also contained a Plutarch, was accepted at this time, but they were not allowed to see their son. The accompanying letter was the last word that Dietrich Bonhoeffer received from his family.
7 February 1945. Dear Dietrich, your birthday letter for the 4th, which we wanted to bring on Saturday, did not reach you because of the raid. Karl Friedrich has chosen the Plutarch for your birthday. I hope that this letter reaches you. We are looking forward to being allowed to see you soon. There are many things to be sorted out at our age, things that have to be discussed with one's children. I'm typing this so it can be easily read. Our hearty greetings, your father.
It was the same afternoon of February 7, 1945, that Dietrich Bonhoeffer vanished without trace from the Gestapo prison in Berlin. It was only a week later, on the next Parcels Day, February 14th, that his parents discover that there was no longer anyone at the heavily damaged Prinz Albrechtstrasse prison to receive their gifts. And it was still months later, only through the BBC, did the survivors hear of the last stages of Bonhoeffer's journey. On February 7, 1945, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was transported to the notorious Buchenwald concentration camp near Weimar. He was housed in a basement prison, damp, cold, and dark without daylight. There was a communal washroom, and next to it was the dampest cell, cell number 1 for Dietrich Bonhoeffer. As Easter Sunday of April 1st, 1945 approached, the thunder of American cannons from the woods nearby could be heard in the basement. For the prisoners, these guns heralded the sounds of freedom. However, their joy and hope was short-lived. The guards began a mass execution. In special instructions from Berlin, camp inmates were routinely massacred in face of the approaching enemy. Prisoners in the basement cell were given new orders to be ready to leave at any moment, even by foot. Did that mean they were to share the fate of the others who were taken to the woods and executed? On Tuesday, April 3rd, a huge truck rolled out of Buchenwald carrying Bonhoeffer and others in a southeasterly direction. The hearts of the inmates sank. They were going to Flossenburg. It was for them an ominous name. On the way, Bonhoeffer was a source of comfort and strength to the many prisoners. A fellow prisoner, Hugh Falconer, described those days to Dietrich's sister, Sabine, a few months later.
He did a great deal to keep some of the weaker brothers from depression and anxiety. He spent a good deal of time with Wassenaar Corcoran, who was a delightful young man, although an atheist. I think your brother divided his time between instilling the foundations of Christianity and learning Russian.
Soon they were relieved to discover that the truck was going south. It was not going to be the annihilation camp. By late Friday, April 6th, they were approaching Schönberg, 25 miles north of Passau. They were housed in this small schoolhouse being used as a temporary lockup. Bonhoeffer was among the special cases taken to the second floor. That afternoon and next day, Saturday, April 7th, 1945, Bonhoeffer and his fellow prisoners enjoyed the view of the lovely Green Mountain Valley, oblivious that in a midday discussion 2 days earlier, on Thursday, April 5th, Hitler had given special orders that all the conspirators be immediately executed. On Sunday, April 8th, 1945, several prisoners requested Bonhoeffer to lead them in a prayer service to celebrate Low Sunday, the first Sunday after Easter. There was only one difficulty: the presence of the avowed atheist Corcoran. Despite Bonhoeffer's longing to conduct the service, he refused because he did not want to exclude Corcoran from any activity. Surprisingly, Corcoran desired to be included and himself asked Bonhoeffer to conduct the service. Bonhoeffer offered a meditation on 1 Peter 1:3.
Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. By his great mercy we have been born anew to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead.
He spoke of their present state and the future that awaits them, freedom or death.
Whichever it may be, the true renewal has already taken place in our hearts. 2 things have happened. First, Christ has died for us men in our salvation. We live because he died. Then the second, because of this, God has renewed us. We are new men, unstained by the past.
After this service, the prisoners wanted to smuggle Bonhoeffer to their room so that he could hold a service there too. They were interrupted as the door was pushed open by 2 Gestapo members in civilian clothes. They called out, "Prisoner Bonhoeffer, get ready and come with us." By now it was clear to everyone Bonhoeffer was to be executed. He was able to get his things together. He wrote his name and address in large letters with a blunt pencil in his Plutarch, in the front, back, and middle. This book, which he had been given by his brother Karl Friedrich in the Gestapo basement prison of Albrechtstrasse, was found and passed on to the family as the last sign of Dietrich's life. Bonhoeffer said his final goodbyes. Payne Best records Bonhoeffer's last words, a message for Bishop Bell of Chichester.
This is the end. For me, the beginning of life.
The journey from Schönberg to the Flossenburg concentration camp lasted till late evening.
Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. He never will suffer the righteous to fall. He is at thy right hand.
On Hitler's personal orders, the SS summary court held a short trial in the laundry of the concentration camp. The death penalty for high treason was pronounced on Wilhelm Canaris, Hans Oster, Karl Sack, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But for Bonhoeffer, death had lost its sting and grave its victory. With an indomitable faith in God, he approached his end.
Death, throw off our grievous chains and raise the thick walls of our mortal body and our blinded soul, so that at last we may behold what we have failed to see in this place. Freedom, long we have sought you through discipline, through action, and through suffering. Now that we are dying, we see you there in the face of God.
For still our ancient foe doth seek to work us woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate. Yet our God doth prevail there.
Even in dying, Bonhoeffer left a powerful testimony of costly grace. Grace bought at a price. His last witness was an SS camp doctor. He knew nothing about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He would never understand Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theology, yet he could never forget Dietrich Bonhoeffer's faith. 10 years later, he wrote,
On the morning of that day, I saw Pastor Bonhoeffer before taking off his prison garb, kneeling on the floor, praying fervently to God. I was most deeply moved by the way this lovable man prayed, so devout and so certain that God heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a short prayer and then climbed the steps to the gallows, brave and composed. His death ensued after a few seconds. In the almost 50 years that I worked as a doctor, I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God.
On April 11th, 1945, the American forces liberated the Buchenwald concentration camp. Tragically, just 6 days earlier, on April 5th, 1945, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was transported to Flossenburg to be hanged. On April 30th, 1945, ironically, 3 weeks after ordering the execution of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Hitler himself committed suicide in this bunker. And in his schoolhouse in Reims, France, on May 7th, 1945, less than a month after Dietrich Bonhoeffer's execution, the Third Reich surrendered to the Allies. The war in Europe was over. Bonhoeffer's family waited anxiously for him or for news about him, but there was no trace. Only coincidentally, on July 24th, 1945, his parents tuned into a radio broadcast from London. What they heard was a memorial service for their son. 3.5 months had passed since that fateful Monday, April 9th, 1945, when his family first heard of his execution. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, hanged as a 39-year-old. Lest this man forever becomes a monument, we must remember him more than just as a martyr. In relation to the situations in which he found himself, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was an authentic witness to Jesus Christ. In both, through his life and his death, he has demonstrated how we should respond in faithfulness to the gospel.
One must completely abandon any attempt to make something of oneself, whether it be a saint or a sinner, a righteous man or an unrighteous man. In so doing, we throw ourselves completely into the arms of God, taking seriously not our own sufferings, but those of God in the world, watching with Christ in Gethsemane. That is faith, that is repentance, and that is how one becomes a Christian. How can success make us arrogant, or failure lead us astray when we share in God's sufferings through a life of this kind? May God in His mercy lead us through these times, but above all, may He lead us to Himself.